We're experimental Jetset. We started in 1997 when we graduated at the Gerrit Rietveld Academy. My name is Marieke.
My name is Erwin.
Danny. My name is Danny. And the name Experimental Jetset actually comes from a Sonic Youth album. There's a funny story attached to that, in the sense that we actually set out to name our studio after a song by the Specials, a British ska band. And the name of that song was actually International Jetset, which, now that I think about it, is quite interesting in relationship to the international style. But we came to the Chamber of Commerce, where you had to register your name. And at that moment, it was explained to us that International Jetset, as we originally want to call ourselves, was not specific enough, because for some reason they also wanted in the name something included that would say something about the activity you were involved in. And international, they thought it was not specific enough. So at the spot we came up with Experimental Jetset, which was an album by Sonic Youth, a band that we also really like a lot, and it came out at that time. So we just at the spot turned it from international into Experimental Jetset, and since that it has been our name. It's a bit of a silly name. You always get into troubles when you're asking for receipts or you have to explain your name through the telephone. You always have to spell it out, but I guess at a certain moment you were just stuck with the name, and then it's too late to change, we guess. In the relationship of Swiss style, of international style, Swiss design, I think it's maybe important to say that when we studied at the Rietveld, we were quite unaware of this whole thing called the Swiss international style, or this whole typographic language. It was during a time
in fact, we didn't even had lessons in typography. Or in history, design history.
For some reason, at the Rietveld Academy in '97, I don't know, the feeling at that time was pretty much that print was dead. It's funny because we now have this feeling all over again. But this was really the time when a lot of people in our department were more experimenting with video, with photography, installations, and there wasn't in the graphic design department a lot of attention for graphic design, because people already had the feeling that it was all over and it was just a matter of years or something before it would all end for some reason. So, I mean, as for our own influence or being influenced by the Swiss international style, if this is indeed the case, it has always been a very indirect influence, in the sense that we feel we have been influenced very much by this whole visual landscape of the 70s in which we grew up as children. And this landscape was for a large part designed by people like Wim Kruijel, Benno Wissing, Ben Bos, that whole total design studio atmosphere, and we sort of grew up in that. So we picked up those influences in a almost unconscious way, or
unconscious.
Unconscious.
Yeah, it was. All our school books were designed by people like Total Design, or even the logo of the city where we were born was designed by Total Design. So it was everywhere you looked when we were young. So it's something that gets under your skin. It's almost like a language.
Well, I also think that when when we graduated in 1997 was the moment that type was available on a larger scale because of the computer. So there was this one computer in our school, and all of a sudden you could take whatever you wanted, and we tried it out. We experimented with it, and it was not so much satisfying in a way, because we ended up being completely confused and annoyed every time. So then we thought maybe it's a good idea just to focus on one typeface and try to work with that every time we want to say something. So it's more like in the exploration of the material you work with. And then, of course, Linda van Deursen was explaining all about Bauhaus. Actually, her interest was also more about Bauhaus, and she introduced it to us. And I guess after school, when we left the Rietveld, it was more like self-study.
In a strange way, I think because when we were studying, we were quite interested in what was happening at that time in the States with David Carson and really that style, and which I still love. I mean, when I think about some of those early issues of Reagan, it still gives me almost goosebumps or something. But I think what those designers were doing was also looking back in a way at really American roots. David Carson had also this interest in vernacular photography type on signs that were already half decayed, typical in a sort of American way, where you have these ghost towns with decayed signs, but they aren't really decayed signs in the Netherlands in that sense. So it was through those American designers who were sort of reflecting on their national identity, if you want, that we also thought, well, maybe we should look back at our cultural heritage and look about, you know, we didn't grow up in surf places or deserts or.
What a shame.
we grew up in this 70s Netherlands social democratic environment. So maybe we should look at that if we want to explore our own language and you know the language that has shaped us. So in a specific way, people like David Carson did influence us to look back to our own heritage.
But I also think it was a way of going against the feeling that anything goes. I mean, graphic design. Around that time, when we were at Academy, it was putting as much layers and influences and as much typefaces in a design as possible. And I think we were also kind of going against that in trying to say as much with as less as few typefaces as possible, or as using no colors and only black and white, and trying to see how little you can use to make a design.
We always have been really interested in this idea of, already since we graduated, this whole idea of dialectical thinking, or this idea that things are not necessarily cyclical, that things return all the time, and not linear, that things are just going straight forward, but that there's always this sort of development, that there's something happening, something against, and then there's a third position that sort of tries to merge the two previous positions in a sort of third position. And I think it was already very clear to us that it was inevitable in a way that sort of 70s environment in which we grew up, we wanted to sort of synthesize it with all these influences we picked up later, and we were trying to make sense of them, and also not only try to show the differences, but also see how they could be compared and how they could merge together. So in that sense, that whole idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis in all our way of thinking and working, it always plays a pretty big role. It's funny, I mean, we often use the analogy of languages. I mean, we find languages a much more interesting word than style in that regard. And one of the things that is interesting about languages is the fact that a language immediately also means that there are dialects, accents, jargons, pitching, all these different variations of a language. So in a way, this whole idea of a sort of local design language and a sort of global design language, in a way they go together, in the sense that the moment that a language, which goes for visual language as well as actual languages, the moment a language becomes universal or international, that same moment that language also is fragmented in all these different accents. Within this tendency of a language to become universal, there's always this sort of counter tendency in it that sort of let the whole universal language sort of split up in all these different other jargons and accents, which is interesting, I guess, and also like a beautiful, almost paradoxical phenomenon. Something becomes universal, but the moment it becomes universal, it becomes actually less universal because people will use that standard language as their own platform, which you also see with of course, the international style. The moment that that style was sort of when it came to some kind of template in Switzerland. Of course, it started internationally to begin with. There was the concrete art style, which was from Theo van Doesburg, so Dutch, but he started in Paris, the concrete art. And then you had the Neue typography from Tiegold, and then you had influences from Russian constructivism. So it was already sort of international to begin with. And then there is this sort of in-between station in Switzerland, and then it becomes international again. And then you see all these local accents. Wim Kruijel does a very sort of Dutch version of the international style. It is like a typical Dutch accent he adds to it, which is totally different than, for example, the more Italian-American accent that Vignelli put to it. And so, yeah, I mean, it is international, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is that it is a sort of homogeneous or some kind of that it's all the same. It's actually a sort of platform in which all these local differences...
We always think when you have one thing that is the same, you can see the difference much more.
I like the idea that Swiss design from that time had a certain concreteness, and which you can hear in that constant use of the word concrete in the exhibitions that were held, and I think that the concreteness for us, even more than the idea of the grid or the systematic, but just the idea that these posters, when you talk about posters, were not sort of painterly windows into another world, or they weren't romantic tableaus with a sort of the artist's brushstroke, but they were just pieces of paper that were organized in a very transparent way, and that made these posters very recognizable as concrete objects, as very, as things, as material. And that is something we also, that we recognize in our own approach. The sort of concreteness that we try to see the printed poster as a concrete object.
And also as something that is constructed instead of something that is reduced. We always start with nothing and then try to build something up instead of starting with something and then reducing it until the essence is the only thing that remains.
I was thinking a while ago, we had this interview for an American graphic design magazine, Print, and it was a sort of conversation between us and Meta Heaven. And at a certain point, it was about how the international style is in a way very much still around us, especially in the digital and online sense. When you, all the things you think of, you think of the international style, the ragged, the unjustified text, the use of grids and systems, even the use of undercast letters. That when you write an email and text, everybody uses undercast letters, and nobody justifies the text on their email. It's always ragged, and everything. People use templates, and so it's very much in a way when you look at the internet environment. I think the international style is quite, on a superficial level, it's quite visible, and even the most craziest images on Tumblr or spinning GIFs and stuff, when you click on archive on Tumblr, it immediately snaps to a grid and it becomes a grid again. So in that sense, the visual, but even I think the functional, maybe the whole economic idea of running things efficiently, that is quite pretty much prevalent within this online environment. But the thing that's interesting is you were talking about the printing, the concrete printing element of it, and that is the only thing that's missing. But that is a fundamental difference, I think, because the international style, of course, in its printed form, had this promise of a universal message or a collective message. You put a poster in the street, and everybody sees this poster in the same way. Everybody who walks past it. So it's a very much the promises or the statements that these posters made are universal and collective and visible for everyone.